at the end. Here we go.
Great. Thanks, Liz. Hello, good afternoon to everybody. We are delighted to have you here with us today. And in addition to Liz's expression of gratitude to the Indigenous people of this land, I also just wanted to acknowledge and recognize that I am joining you today from the land of the Katzie First Nation. So I extend my deep, heartfelt gratitude to Indigenous people who have been and continue to be the custodians of this land. So why are we having this conversation today? You know, Robin and Steph are two of my go-to people when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, in particular around anti-racism and children. You know, it's often on Facebook, I'll be like, hey, Robin, I need a book about this for kids. And so Robin's always very generous with her knowledge. And Steph also, we are constantly sharing books back and forth. So when we decided to have this conversation, when Liz and Annick and I decided that this would be a great topic, there was no question who we would speak to. So just to give our listeners and participants here today a little bit of an understanding of your backgrounds and your families, perhaps Robin and Steph, you could tell us a little bit about your biracial families and also a little bit from your background, how you grew up. So Robin, why don't we start with you?
Sounds good. So for me, I come from Saskatchewan, the rural parts of Saskatchewan. And I grew up there, raised by a white mother, and predominantly because my dad, I would see him on the weekends, probably every 6 weeks or so. And so I grew up in an area where I was generally the only brown person in my class, and at times the only person in my school. And it felt like at times the only one in my town, actually. And so in a very sort of white-centered environment, which, you know, just by default has racism. I think to this day, I'm still sort of figuring out my racial identity and my relationship to it, and you know, working on that sense of self-worth that comes from growing up in that environment. And now I'm married to somebody of Scandinavian descent, and I have 3 kids. One of them, the eldest, is, you know, as dark as me, if not darker. The middle one is a complete mix, and the youngest one came out and had me totally shocked, being blonde and blue-eyed and looks completely like his father, and you wouldn't know that I was involved. So yeah, it's now I'm on this journey to be able to raise them in a position where they have a really strong sense of self-worth and a sense of racial identity as they walk this world in very different ways from each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Robin. And that's what I find so fascinating is that children in the same family can have different experiences as well. So thank you. Steph, how about you?
Yeah. Well, like Robin, I grew up in a small town. That's sort of where I feel like our paths are similar. So grew up in a small town in BC, Trail, BC. And it really was 95% white and Italian. And I fit into that sort of, you know, that privilege. And I didn't really, you know, all of some of those stereotypes of not seeing race was kind of how I was, you know, raised, you know, with two white parents. So of course, in my mind, subconsciously, I was probably going to marry a white man. And, you know, to my, I don't know if I'd say surprise or just, it just happened. My husband is Filipino, and I didn't really think much. I will say my journey into thinking about EDI probably started when I met my husband, and he actually, you know, would, you know, mention things like, what are you going to do if we have children and they look different from you? And your daughter says, or, you know, son says they want to look like you. So these various things, I'm so grateful, but I didn't have to think about it, right? Like that was that privilege that I walked through. Mm-hmm. We have one child. She's almost 16. And so she has that sort of mixed the mixed race, and I found, an interesting story. I remember she was like 6 months old, and I was asked, "Are you the nanny?" And
Ah,
that, that sort of, there's those moments of,
yeah.
was I a bit offended? Am I going to go into the horrific details of childbirth? Not that it was not horrific. Sorry. I'm a bit cheeky sometimes. I joke about things, but like, is this the time? It was a lot of questioning. So
Mhm.
that I think that I'm constantly on this journey from when, and my daughter's name is Elise. And so when she's little to now, as we sort of navigate, being a teen.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another element that I think is interesting, that you both bring different perspectives, because you're parenting a teenage girl, and Robin, you have 3 boys who are little. So there's different conversations and different perspectives. And thank you for sharing that comment, Steph, about, are you the nanny? Because I was just wondering, and this is just one of those tiny little aha moments or reminders that we make so many instant assumptions on what we see, based on perhaps, our life experience, all of that, our unconscious bias. But we make so many assumptions, just based on what's right in front of us, and we don't really know what's kind of under the waterline of that, the iceberg that we talk a lot about in equity, diversity, and inclusion. Robin, you very generously wrote 2 blog posts for the blog that Anik and I have with Leda HR. And I will say to everybody, we asked Robin to write one. And when she sent it to me, I said, oh my God, there's so much here. We're going to make this 2 blog posts because I loved it.
Yeah.
I loved it. And there were so many great, I just found it fascinating to read. For myself, and by the way, like, big shocker, if anybody can see me, I'm a white woman, and if you don't know, I don't have kids, so this is a topic that I find fascinating, and I am endlessly curious about it. So, Robin, in the first post that you wrote for us, you shared 8 tools for your anti-racism and pro-inclusion parenting toolkit. And one of the points that you made, and there we go, got the slide deck going there, is privilege is real and it's not fair. And I love that so much. And Steph, you just mentioned, as you go about your life growing up in Trail, your everyday privilege is that you're just part of the majority. And privilege is something we don't have to think about. So you experienced inclusion without even being conscious of it. So, this idea that this is the first tool that you wrote about, Robin, I think is so important, because this is such a tough idea for people to wrap their heads around. In particular, white people, absolutely, because we can get really defensive. Well, I had a hard life too, and privilege is just, it's not that you didn't have a hard life. It's just that, guess what? My skin color hasn't gotten in the way of me achieving anything in life. So, in North America, and you mentioned this as well, Robin, we live in such a white-centered culture, which inherently means that it is discriminatory in many ways that white people don't see. So how do you talk to your kids about it? How do you have those conversations, in particular with small children? And I wonder, because kids have a way of doing this, have they simplified this concept of privilege in a way that, adults just can't? So what are your thoughts on that, Robin?
The simplified it took some thinking, so I'm not sure I'll be able to get that fully answered, but it made me think of an example when I was, thinking through this. And the kids, they're into this show right now. It's called Walk the Prank, I think. I don't know if anyone's ever watched it. It's on Netflix. It's like a candid camera type of show. Yeah, but it's run by kids. So kids put on these pranks, and then they're the ones, hop out and say you're on camera. But in this particular situation, there was a family sitting at a table with their kids, and the kids were becoming progressively tough to deal with for the restaurant. And across from them was a couple, and the prank was on the man of the couple across from them. And so, he ends up showing up like the most patient person on earth, because these kids like are acting up, and their parents are just enthralled in conversation, and they're just doing, they start throwing things, they're doing more and more things. And eventually it gets to the point where they go and they start trying to eat from his plate, and the parents aren't stepping in. And he eventually, starts to say, kids, like, stop, please. And he intervenes. And then they finally end the prank, because he just wasn't going to get more worked up than that. But what was interesting about it, and what I drew my son's attention to in that moment, was that he's Black, and those kids sitting at that table and those parents are white. And so the conversation right away in that moment was, is this fair? Was this a fair prank? Was it really a prank, or was it putting somebody in a position where they're being victimized? And we talked about, what about that situation was not fair? It's, first of all, it's in the States. It's in a position where he's probably not able to say something to, or feel safe in an environment correcting the behavior of white kids. And how, if he had been white, maybe that would have been different. And maybe he would have lost his temper earlier. Maybe he would have been allowed to, and that would have been okay and a normal thing for that restaurant. And so we just talked through that. And that's really for us what it looks like. It's a series of conversations like that, where you have in the moment situations, and then it's triggered for myself, like, whoa, this is totally, like, I'm getting bad feelings about this situation. Let's talk about it. But he had been laughing up until that point. And then it's a conversation about how, the older one, if he was in that situation, what it would be like, and then the younger ones, because they're lighter, and how it might be different for each of them.
Right.
And so
Wow.
there's one other story that came to mind too, and it was my older son, and he was, I don't know where we were. I want to say we were like at a parking lot someplace, but anyway, he saw a police car and a police officer come out, and he started talking about how the police are like so good, and how he likes to talk to them and everything. And it was like great. Like, I'm glad that that's his perception right now. But we did, get into a conversation around, like, you're going to have to trust your instincts with police officers, because some are good and some don't always understand where you're coming from, and they might make assumptions about you, and getting into those types of conversations. So, and we have that conversation around like play guns, around, all of those types of things, like when they're running around and like buying shields and stuff at a toy store, like,
Yeah.
when he buys new clothes and it's like black hoodies and things like that, like, just,
Oh boy. Yeah.
all of those types of things. So it's really helping them understand that, there is a privilege to not having to think about those things, and that I'm putting them in a position where they do need to talk about it. And we're not trying to rob childhood or anything, but we have to be thoughtful about them.
Yeah. That's interesting that you just say, like, we don't want to rob someone's childhood. And I'm just thinking obviously Friday was just National Truth and Reconciliation Day and Orange Shirt Day. And every once in a while I hear this refrain from parents that, we have to be careful about what we teach kids about the residential school system, because it can be very traumatizing. And the flip side of that is children went to residential schools and they experienced that trauma. So I think it's, I can only imagine, not being a parent, but it is a fine line that you walk in these conversations, and how you make them age appropriate, where they're realistic, but they're also not, you're not scaring anybody as well. It's, I love that you touched on the police situation. I remember a few years ago, debate here in Metro Vancouver, and I'm sure this happened in many cities, around pride parades. And, the Vancouver Police Department was asked to not participate in the pride parade. And a lot of people didn't understand that. And until this conversation was first happening, me as a heterosexual woman didn't really understand, because I haven't had to fear the police. But there's a long history there that we don't always understand. And so again, that's the idea of privilege. But Steph, you and I were talking one day over coffee, as we often do. And you told me such an interesting story, an experience that Elise had this summer. So perhaps you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, so it was one of the fireworks nights, and myself and Elise, we went to friends, and her other friend, they were going to go and sort of wander around Davie and whatnot. And it was getting darker, and we just sort of said, okay, well, like, let us know, don't be out sort of too long. And yeah, Elise was like, well, not worried, the police, if we need something, the police is there for us. And the other mother friend of mine was like, well, yeah, and police are good sometimes, and we also just need to be careful. And my daughter, she was like, oh yeah, you're right. And so in the car on the way home, we had this sort of, hey, I want to talk about it. And she was very much like, yeah, Mom, gosh, I felt really embarrassed, as soon as I said that. And her mom made that comment because immediately I realized what I had said. And I said, well, that's okay. Right. I don't want you to be so embarrassed you don't say something, but let's have a little bit of a conversation about this. And it also is this sort of discussion around, also white passing, right? So it was one of those moments where I think Elise probably sort of feels like maybe she can pass more, lighter skin. And,
Yeah.
And so that was kind of an interesting sort of discussion. I will say though, as sort of Robin had sort of reiterated, it's these sort of ongoing conversations, and I will sort of share, even though I do this work day in and day out, when it's your family and in the moment, I've probably said things that are, that I've had to go back because I do a bit of reflection on various other topics. I might say something and then, it's I realize the importance of that in the moment. Like it really, and I feel like it's even in the workplace, right? Like if you don't have these topics in the moment, to go back 4 hours the next day, 3 days later, you of course can, but it's not as effective as to sort of stop it and have a bit of a discussion right then in the moment, because people don't remember. But on the flip side, I will also say though, I've gone back where I was like, look, I needed to do a bit of research on this because I felt like when I discussed something, I thought maybe that wasn't the right thing. And I've done some other research and I'd like to sort of just bring this up to discuss with you. So I've also done that.
Yeah. So you have a growth mindset. Right. And I think that, one of the things that I just so appreciate about what you are both saying is that you're talking about this stuff. Right. Like I think about, years ago, well, I know this still happens. And so, here's the scenario. It's a parent and a child, and the child, says or points to a person who it's visible that they have a disability and says perhaps loudly, Mom or Dad, what's wrong with that person? And the mom or dad is so uncomfortable that they're just like, oh, shh, come on, no, we don't talk about it. So now what you're doing is you're saying, we don't, like, you're literally and figuratively saying, we don't talk about this stuff. This is different. It's not safe. So to create an environment where, whether it's with your kids, your family, your friends, or in the workplace, where it's okay to be imperfect, it's okay to make mistakes, but what's not okay is to not learn from those mistakes. Right. And so I love that Elise said, I feel embarrassed.
Yeah.
Not that I'm happy she was embarrassed, but it's like she's like having that, like she is tossing around this idea of privilege. And, as you both so eloquently described, I mean, the different levels of privilege based on the tone of your skin. Right. So two kids of color are not always going to have the same experiences.
Kristen, can I just add something to that?
Yeah, please.
It's interesting too, right? Because like when you're biracial, I think too, you identify with different parents at different times.
Yeah, I bet.
And I think sometimes it's not even necessarily white passing, but white feeling. Right? Like there was a time where I had this, and it's embarrassing to me to this day, so I'm surprised I'm sharing it right now, but I'll share it anyway. But I was in a conversation with a group of people, and I said, yeah, I've never been in an interracial relationship except for, when I was down in Brazil, where I'd, dated somebody darker. And they said, what are you talking about, Robin? Every relationship you're in is interracial.
Interesting.
Right. And it was like it was like, I was, I think 18 at the time when I said it.
Yeah.
And like up until that point, it hadn't occurred to me, of course I knew that I was brown and I knew that I had like a racial identity around that, but I wasn't connecting that to my personal relationship.
Oh my gosh, that's what a fabulous aha moment.
Yeah.
And it ties in with this term that we use a lot now in equity, diversity, and inclusion, which is how do you identify?
Exactly.
In terms of like if somebody's asking for data collection, of course Liz knows all about this, right? Like it's not up to me to say, oh well, I think we have 4 brown people and 10 white people here in our company. No. It's not up to me to decide. It's up to that person to say, no, this is how I identify. For sure. There was sorry, Liz, go ahead.
I was just going to note that like a lot of things that we survey in ways that we identify, sometimes they change. Like sometimes people's awareness in how they identify. Sometimes that's based on just like understanding, your origins and your origin story a little bit more as well. So I think giving people the room to have that as well, because we do that with things like sexual orientation, because we tend to
fluidity.
that. Yeah, we recognize that more in adults than we do like in children, but like there is, we can change throughout our lives.
And there's new language that comes out too, right? And just new stories that come out. You start to see your own experiences mirrored in the media, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I identify with that. Yeah, that's me too. So
yeah, amazing.
I find it fascinating how we're spending more time talking about identity, and that identity is like a superpower, right? Like those identities that you bring to an organization are really powerful and impactful, and we want to know who's here. Where for many years it was like just fit into the cookie cutter. We don't want to know about your identities.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, here's another idea or concept. Self-esteem building in a social media world. I am so grateful that when I was growing up, social media was not a thing, because there's already enough pressure on us in society. So there's a lot of messages that we receive, and our social media, while I think you can use it for good, cultivate your feeds, right? Unfollow people who don't leave you feeling better about yourself. But there's a lot of really harmful messages that can be amplified about a kid's value or an adult's value, and where you belong or where you don't belong. So how do you help your kids to build self-esteem and not buy into those really powerful messages about stigma and shame? Robin, do you want to jump in on that one first?
Yeah, I made a few notes for myself on this, just things that had come to mind when I saw these questions first. I think, the big one for me, because growing up, I would hear a lot of sort of excuses for racism. And it was, with the best of intentions, people saying, well, I think they're just trying to be nice, or not nice, but like trying to do something else, or maybe they were just in a bad mood, or excuses, right? And so I think the number one thing that I want to make clear to my kids is that racism is the shortcoming of the racist.
I love that.
Right?
Somebody write that down, please.
It's like not something to fix in yourself. Whatever's being picked at, it's not the thing to fix. They're the thing that need to work on it. So that's sort of a key message for me. Another one is a lot of the things that I grew up feeling bad about were really sort of body related. Right. And so for me, it's really important to normalize brown and Black bodies and the things that come with that. And I'm starting to find like little ways to do that as my kids get older. But, my eldest had really curly hair like I did when I was little and wanted it to be straight.
Yeah.
And so like really creating pride around those curls. And now, he grows it long to his shoulders and it's very curly. So, but cultivating that. Not sort of giving into like, wanting to straighten it and all these different things. But it's something as simple as like body hair, Like us brown
Mhm.
folks, we can be hairier. And I'd had
Yeah.
a friend actually through Grand City, we got into this conversation where he had a lot of pride in his body hair, and he was talking about how his son was being teased and how he said to him, but that's how we are. Like, this is the good stuff,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
and really sort of cultivating that. So I'm trying to do that as well.
Mhm.
And it's just like, you know, my needs always were different than everybody else's. Like, it's just the
Yeah.
things like that that normalize it and demonstrate that those things are beautiful.
Yeah.
And then I think, you know, around the self-esteem bit and really cultivating it, it's just, and this is just like a parenting thing in general, but being really careful about the language we use when correcting behavior. You know, so people understand that we're correcting the behavior and not saying that anything is wrong with that person, like not cultivating shame, all that Brene Brown good stuff,
Yes. The
right?
queen. Yeah. Yeah.
And then it just, you know, I think it goes that it trickles down into all the other things that aren't necessarily race related.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a lot in there for us adults to take away too. Yeah. Thanks, Robin.
Yeah.
Steph, what about you? I mean,
Yeah.
you've got a teenager.
Yeah, and I mean, I echo all of those things that Robin was saying, and I definitely think from the body perspective, what I appreciate now and what I see is this shift to sort of all bodies, right? And that there's, you know, potentially, you know, it's not this one sort of size. And I love that I can see other sort of fitness instructors that are like, I follow this amazing Black fitness instructor, Healthy with Kelsey. So I'm just going to throw a plug. I don't get any, you know, any kickbacks or anything, but like, she is just so like really focused on body positivity that I think you know, that I would have loved, you know, to have had that growing up, to sort of see that and not that sort of stereotypical what we think in the sort of the 80s there, right? I also feel like we have lots of discussions around polarization in social media. And I think I see it a lot of the, you know, things are either good or bad, you know, and we get, you know, 20 seconds of snippets or 30-second videos on racism. And it's so like there's so many layers to it. And I feel like so we have lots of discussions around critical thinking and trying to sort of realize, is that true, is that not true, is it true for you, or where's the source of that information, right? And I think I mean that's constant, because I mean I've caught myself reacting to a social media post without even taking the time, you know, you get immediately caught up with, oh my gosh, this is awful, that's it, this is terrible, like, and
Right.
I catch myself, right? And so lots of discussion on that kind of the what are you seeing and getting constantly. I will also say too, there are so many apps that do photo editing and
Oh,
video
yes.
editing. So like you just don't even know what is
Yeah.
real. I know now I feel like I'm starting very extreme, but it's true. Like you just
Yeah.
don't know, is that like, has that been sort of photoshopped or not?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's smoke and mirrors. And
Mhm.
I really appreciate what you're saying about the critical thinking piece. And I know that Annika and I have talked about this a lot because she is the mom of a 12-year-old boy. And so there's lots of conversations that happen around, you know, and I'm going to steal one of the things I learned from her years ago, which I love, and she uses this a lot when we do workshops, is what don't I know?
Mm.
So, you know, we can go up that ladder of inference really quickly because we make assumptions, because we have unconscious bias, all of these things. But just a really short pause to say, okay, I'm having a reaction. Why am I having the reaction? And what don't I know about this person or this situation? And that can really help us actually to better understand each other. But yeah, this the self-esteem building is a hard one, and I think it's lifelong work for everyone. But if you can help kids right from the start, and by the way, Robin, as somebody with naturally curly dark hair, as a kid, boy, I wanted, and I'm going to so date myself, not everybody's going to get this reference. I wanted the Dorothy Hamill haircut from the 1970s. It was like straight. And if it could have been blonde, I would have been really happy. But, you know, you get what you get. You know, this other concept, thanks to Robin from her blog post, which was full of nuggets, adults aren't always right. Oh my gosh, what a shock, right? And guess what? Human beings are imperfect. So this concept of, you know, for kids to understand and recognize that, you know what, the adults in your life aren't always going to get it right. So how do we accept that we are flawed and that we make mistakes? How can we take that idea to the workplace and create cultures where we can talk about these hard things and to recover from the mistakes that we'll inevitably make? So Steph, you touched on this already a little bit. Like you said, sometimes I'll go away and I'll think about it. Maybe I'll come back a half an hour later or 2 days later. You know, how do we, some people are brave and will do it regardless of maybe the culture. And some cultures are harder, workplace cultures are harder to talk about these things. So how do you, because I know in your role, director of EDI at TransLink, you think about this stuff all the time. How do you create a culture where people can actually think critically and have that growth mindset and be curious, and it's okay to fail? Have you figured it out? Can you tell us how to do this?
Well, I'm so glad you asked a very simple question that I'll have a two-word answer to. No, I will. Yeah, you're right. I do think about it all the time because I think so. And I think what you're talking about is that term that we've probably heard and it's overused, but the psychological safety piece, right? That psychological safety piece. So that, you know, and I define it sort of very similar to kind of how Amy Edmondson talks about it. It's the, because I wrote it on a sticky here, by the way, so I'm just going to read it for a sec, if that's okay. The belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, and that the team is safe to take risks. And I really do feel that you can't get to sort of the hierarchy of needs. Like if you don't have that at the very bottom, you don't get to belonging and inclusion if you don't have that, really. It is that sort of that fundamental sort of air and water, you know, I think, and I think how you get there is a few different ways. One, I mean, for myself, it's like, I need to be a role model. So it's like, it's on me to make sure to like call myself out, to appreciate differences and people to push back on my ideas and whatnot. I do think, and I always go back to the sort of, I talk about our middle managers because they're the ones always sort of, you know, they get these big sort of objectives and goals that the CEO or the VPs have created, and they're the ones who have to execute on them. Right. And I think managers need to do a lot of self-work on themselves and self-awareness. And I think if managers aren't, I don't know how you can be an effective manager in 2022. Like it really, I really don't know. And so creating that support for managers to make mistakes, I think like it is also, I see the CEOs need to make mistakes and own it and be vulnerable. Like again, to be a CEO in 2022 and not share a personal story or a vulnerability or a, oh my gosh, I said something, like we should just treat everybody the same. And, you know, we know how that went. Like really, you know, people need to say that. And then without being, you know, having people to allow them to sort of be called out in a gentle way or called in, however you want it. And then I think it's like on repeat. It's this, you know, you consistently allow others to speak up, to push against, as managers to call it out. I often sort of say in my meetings, I have this idea. What do you think? And a lot of people are like, yeah, great. And I'm like, what's wrong with it? What don't we
Yeah.
like about it?
Yes,
Like
be
there's
curious.
let's think of how it won't
Yeah.
work and push against me, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that group think can be incredibly dangerous, and
It
there's
is.
reasons why that happens, right? We don't
Yeah.
we feel like it's more fun to be with the winning team, and if everybody's agreeing, then I want to be part of that.
Yeah.
But it can be, and you know, this idea of calling people out in the workplace, it can be as simple as, it's not about shaming anybody, because I don't think we achieve anything when we shame people, but it could be as simple as saying, hey, you know, I wonder, have we heard from this person? What voices are we missing?
Yeah.
Or, you know, what's something that we don't know about this situation? Or, you know, so it's just about being curious. At the end of the day, your idea still may be, you know, the best or whatever. But to, you know, I love that idea that you're saying, Steph, is that we need to push against each other, because that's actually how we learn and grow. And so to be a little bit uncomfortable is important. You know, like there's that saying, what if that discomfort is growth? I think it is. And if we're okay with saying that we're not always right, and I always reflect back on, who are the leaders in my career, or even the people that I've most admired in my life, you know, who are those people, and what was it that I really appreciated? It was the fact that they were okay with saying, I don't have all the answers. I'm learning too. Or if you're going through a difficult time within your organization, and everybody knows, but no, it's like the king's new clothes, or what is that thing? The king's new clothes? I'm getting that fairy tale wrong. But anyways, you know, when everybody is like, no, everything's fine. It's like, okay, look, no, it's not fine. We're going through a pandemic. Let's just admit that this is really hard. You know, it's not about being negative. It's also about being authentic and real and vulnerable. And that's also how you can build connections with people.
Yeah.
I think we want our leaders to be relatable. And then I think we
Yes.
want them on top of that to be advocates.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Totally agree. Okay. So there's, you know, a couple of things that have been in the media recently that, boy, have stirred up a lot of discussion. A black little mermaid. My goodness. What is the world coming to? And the Queen. So,
and another one, Lizzo and the flute.
Oh my
this
God,
week, right?
Lizzo and the flute. Yes, I know. This is like it could be a sitcom. A Black Little Mermaid, the Queen, and Lizzo and the flute. Right? Thursday nights at 8:00. You know, this, oh my gosh, like people are taking all of this really personally. And for some people it is very personal. But this idea of privilege and the white-centered world that we live in. So, you know, let's talk a little bit about this. Like, have you had conversations with your kids about this? And, you know, what are some ways that we can, because again, this is uncomfortable for people. So how can we feel okay with being uncomfortable and learning and growing? How can we be anti-racist? Because it's a verb, right? It's not like you can't just say you are, you have to do the work.
Yeah.
Again, just a little question, tiny little question.
No big deal. I think I told you last time we chatted how, like, my great grandfather down in Guyana, he was a servant at the government house, and so he had served the Queen. And so there in our family was this sense of pride around that. But at the same time, I had this discomfort in this vision of this brown man serving the Queen.
Yeah.
And not sort of like sitting beside her at the table, you know?
Yeah.
And then, you know, growing up with a white mom who was definitely like a royalist, like she was into it, you know, like we visited the Queen, and I think it was Princess Di Government House in Saskatchewan, and you know, sort of grew up watching waking up early to watch all the royal weddings.
Yeah.
So there was like a lizard brain part of me who wanted to like tip my hat, drink some tea, you know, but that's like the colonized part of me, right? And then there's another part of me that wanted to like scream out, she's an active colonizer. Why are we spending the money? Why are we holding this up?
Yeah.
Why are we celebrating this? And so definitely like did not have my kids sitting down in front of a TV for this.
Yeah.
And really like sort of started to spend that time unpacking all the things I knew about the Queen and
Right.
my upbringing. So it brought up a lot. But the biggest thing, and it was like sort of a key theme for me, is that this idea of nostalgia, I think, is a really dangerous thing. It seems to be an undercurrent in so many of these things, this idea of like we're hearkening back to something that people are looking upon fondly, but it's only fond for some.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important that people, when they start to feel it, probably stop and examine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know for me, I had a reaction when she died, the Queen died. And then as the week went on, I got angrier about things. And a lot of it was about my own feelings because I was, facing my colonial past as well. My family were settlers. Steph, over to you.
I love that comment, Robin, about the nostalgia, because it is that feeling of like, I just, and I see it, and maybe this is sort of that bigger sort of society perspective. Like, I just want to go back to the way it was. Cause I really, as I say sarcastically, I really like the whiteness and the others, if they could just sort of be quiet again, this
Yeah.
would just be easier for white people, right?
And if women knew their place again, Steph.
Well, thank you for bringing that up. That's very important. Thank you. Yeah, and it's interesting how the nostalgia is positive, but I'm sure there were a lot of negative things around that, but they don't think about that. They hold on to that one piece of that it's so positive. And I do have a hard time understanding why and I'll admit it, I really don't understand why we wouldn't want a Black Little Mermaid, why we wouldn't want a Filipino mermaid, why we wouldn't want a Chinese mermaid, like all of them to give children that self-worth of that, oh my gosh, I see myself in this for everybody. And then now I'm going to be like the consumer on the selfish side. You can sell so many more toys if you have a variety of role models. I'm just gonna, not that I'm promoting consumerism, okay, here, but in reality, right? Like that's, if we go back to, and I know I'm digressing, but it's like, that's how we go back to where they came up with the idea of boys and girls clothes, because it was for many years, it was very neutral. And then consumers realized, oh my goodness, the big box stores realized if they did girl and boys clothes, they could sell a ton more. Right?
Yeah. I know, it's nuts.
And again, I read something recently just talking about how squeaky clean all these things are. And it really is just like, when you're feeling negatively about it, it's just pure racism. Like there's no, like with Lizzo as well, like there's no controversy around her. Like, there's no reason why she shouldn't be playing a flute.
Yeah, it's interesting. And so because it is interesting, and we've got some great comments coming up in the chat too, we wanted to open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to pass this back to Liz, and she's going to facilitate some discussion for us.
Thanks, guys. Well, first of all, I'm curious to see if anybody has questions. I see lots of comments popping up in the chat, but if anyone has a specific question that they'd like to pose to either of our guests, I would certainly welcome. I would certainly welcome that. While you're typing in your questions furiously or thinking of them, there was just a point that I wanted to make when we're talking about racism to children and the way that other people interact with our. If you can hear that baby screaming in the background, there is another adult with them. They're fine. They're a little bit ahead of schedule, but they're fine.
Mine will be next. It's all good.
They'll hear each other. Anyway. Is some of the invisible challenges that people face, in the makeups of their family that we forget about. We sometimes forget about, that families are made in all sorts of different ways, like stepchildren or children that are adopted, or, children that are created, with fertility treatment, that kind of stuff. And we have a big motto in my family that our kids' stories are theirs. We have a lot of people ask questions about our children, and I've watched friends that have adopted children get asked all sorts of ridiculous questions, and we always say, like, that's our kid's story and that's their information, and we don't generally go about asking that. So I just wanted to put that out there. The other thing that I wrote down, to not interrupt people with, is that we often don't think about the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. When we were talking about social media and putting, some of our thoughts to looking critically at social media, as we forget that. We forget the difference between cancel culture and consequence culture. And there's a question here for Robin. What's been your greatest lesson from your kids around racism? It's an easy one, I'm sure.
Yeah. I honestly think it's just that it is so clear that it's learned, that it's not something that's inherent in any way. Yeah, I mean, because I get excited when I see other brown people or Black people sometimes in very white situations, and I guess I don't hide that very much. And then my sort of lighter son, we were in the grocery store the other day, and he pointed at a man and he goes, "Mom, look, he's Black, yay." And it was just so innocent. And I was like, okay, how am I going to explain that reaction? And I'm not going to. And it's just great that he's celebrating that. But also that he feels like good in his own racial identity as well. And so I think, yeah, it's really just that they're sponges, and if we can teach them to be open and teach them, like, we have diversity around them, it's really an opportunity to change the world for the good.
That was a goosebump moment. Change the world for the good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one. Something that I notice a lot. I'm just, as usual, going to have a little guest appearance, so I appreciate all of your patience. Come here. So one of the things that I wanted to say is I've been working in the DEI space for a long time, and before I got into that, I worked with little children, and I catch myself sometimes when my daughter says, when she's telling us about the kids in our school and is telling us about, she's like, "Oh yeah, that's the Black kid," and I have a moment where I'm like, oh, how are we describing people? Like, what are we doing? Because we're not blind to how people look, and we want to be really positive. So how do we want to make sure that we address other people in a respectful way? And I had to stop myself and think and just have that moment of how are, it's not your turn yet, of how are we addressing that?
Any other questions? You're welcome to unmute and pose a question or use the chat.
I had a few others on my list. Now that we've gotten our act together a little bit more over here. How do you guys recommend parents address issues with their children? Because that's the big one that I'm noticing now is children they don't have that filter about talking to people in public around, describing how people look, if it's, people with different shaped bodies or in wheelchairs or, missing limbs. Those are just some of the ones that I've had recently. What actual language do you think people should be using?
Like descriptive language here?
Yeah, I think we always need to be careful with how we correct children, because we don't want to be, too we can't talk about that person's color because we're not doing that. I don't see color anymore. But what's the sentence that you guys would recommend parents say if someone identifies somebody's race right off the bat in the store, for example?
Yeah, like in that moment, how could have I actually explained myself? I honestly would have been just like, we're celebrating, brown presence in a white space.
Yeah.
We had a similar situation again, like my baby was reacting really positively to a Black man in the post office and kept staring at him, and he noticed obviously, and I just said to him, you look like his grandfather and he's enamored with you, and then that got into a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
So or you look different. Like I know the first time my white sister, because my mom remarried white, saw my dad, she just like kept touching his face and couldn't quite understand like what this different color was. And yeah, it's just like explaining it the way that you would explain to a child. And I think I think it's really our own, we feel we're doing the explaining in very matter-of-fact ways, but we just have to practice it.
I think that's good. I agree, you know, and
Yeah.
I catch myself often, and I have a lot of friends actually, they do that. Not even the friends that I'm like, you know, the token lesbian for them, but like friends that I've had forever before I realized I was a lesbian, that I've had for that long, you know, say, like, what's the language that we use for this? Like, how do we go to, you know, drag queen story time and explain, you know, I had to explain recently to our daughter, because we took her to drag queen story time, like, she's like, well, what's a drag queen? So I had to be really careful, because I nearly pigeonholed people that were dressed in drag as just like, it was something that men do. But it was, you know, we had to change it. Like, it's actually something that anybody can do, to dress in costume and, you know, to celebrate something. And man, the fun that you're going to have when you're around drag queens, like, you have no idea. Like, they're going to tell us a story, and it's all about, you know, dressing up. And thankfully, when we went, the drag queen that we'd gone to see encouraged the kids to dress up and had brought clothes for them to dress up in, and sort of, you know, play that out. But, you know, you realize the power of your own language and your own descriptors. Thomas has just given us a very timely reminder about the Little Mermaid. I have a ban on the Little Mermaid in my house, because I really have a problem with the messaging in the Disney version of what it means to be abandoning everything, you know, to hop out of the ocean for some dude is less than ideal. I'm going to hand it over to Annika now to give our heartfelt thank you. Jude thanks you very much as well for your patience.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, and I appreciate we're at the top of the hour if you have to drop off, but yeah, we just wanted to say thank you very much to Robin and Steph for your time, your insights, your authenticity, and as part of that, we want to, Dignii Leda HR want to make a donation on your behalf to Ethos Lab. It's a Black-led STEM and culture-focused innovation academy for youth, age 13 to 18. And we mentioned that for any of you who may be interested in looking up Ethos. And the next slide is when you registered, we did talk about a book draw. So we drew some names before, and if you're on the call, I'll tell you who the lucky winners are. So Ken and Magdalena, you are the winners of the book today. So we'll reach out to you and get your address and make sure we get those books to you. And the last slide is just to let you know the next webinar in our series is Engaging Men, Male Allyship for Gender Equity. It's on Thursday, November 3rd, 10:30 to 11:30 with Jake Stika, the Executive Director of Next Gen Men. So we'd love it if you could join us, and thank you today for being with us and for your questions and comments in the chat. We hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you,
Awesome,
everyone.
thank you.
Have a great day.
Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Mahalo, Thomas.